Hello, all. Welcome to Universal Group of Institutions, Bengaluru. Welcome to a very special edition of the current affairs. Remember this particular image where Donald Trump called it a true liberation day for all of American people, where he said a day of truly American economic independence on the day where he promised that he is going to give the people of the feel of the old golden days of America being the giant of industrialization, where he promised that he is going to bring back the days where American manufacturing base used to be very strong. But suddenly we see that within a span of a few days, he makes a very dramatic U-turn that the tariffs that were imposed, he decides to back down from those tariffs that he imposed, barring the China ware even to the day. In fact, the tariffs have been increased beyond 120. And in retaliation, China has also increased the tariff to the 125% on the American goods. So, what led to this Trump's sudden back off from the tariff announcement? Where he said that, he has announced the 90 days of pause. That means for the next 90 days, next 90 days, the tariffs are not being imposed. And even to the day, on American and on Canadian goods and Mexican goods, the tariff is still existing at the 25 percentage. So one important move, the one important dramatic event that has made Donald Trump to blink first, what was that? That was the bond market freak out as well as the share market bloodbath, where within the span of 4 days, more than $10 trillion of the wealth was wiped out, which is comparable to the market crash of the that has not been seen since the Second World War, or which is more comparable to the the stock market crash of the Black Monday. So in this particular class, we are going to discuss about how the bonds work, what is the position of the United States America with its own debt, and how the other nations perform with respect to their debt, where they stand. At the same time, we're also going to look at what is the standing, or what is the future that holds for the America and the world economy, because this tariff war has unleashed the threat of a trade war at a large scale between the United States of America and China, which happens to be the two powerhouses of the entire world economy. And at the same time, this particular move is going to destabilize the world order which was established by from the US itself. So let us look at the first concept of the day, that is how the bonds work. And what are they? Look at, see, bonds are nothing but the financial instruments. Bonds are nothing but the financial instruments which are used to raise the money from the market. Whenever a government is in need of money, it prints the bond. So that bond will go to the central bank of a nation. Central bank of a nation. The central bank of nation is going to sell it to the corporate houses, commercial banks. Even the people can also buy the bonds in the secondary market. So government is in need of money, so they print the bond and hand it over to the central bank, and central bank is going to hand it over to the another set of players, whom we generally call it as the primary dealers. From the primary dealers in the secondary market, the people can also buy. Okay, so both government as well as the private entity, this is a mechanism through which they can raise the money. So how these bonds work, let us look at some of the basics associated with the bonds. Can you see very clearly? The let's assume the face value of the particular bond is 1,000 rupee. The interest rate which is paid on an annual basis is being called as the coupon rate. Coupon rate is 10%. That means 10% of 1000 is nothing but 100, which we call it as the coupon payment. So what is the maturity period? Maturity period is the 10 years. That means the bond which was purchased by the individual, every year this particular individual will get a coupon payment of 100 rupee. The 1000 rupee which he has paid to the government, this particular 1000 rupee will be returned to him after how many years? 10 years, which we call it as the maturity period. Now this bond which is part of the secondary market, let's say there is no demand for such kind of a bonds, or people are showing a less trust in holding this bond. So what happens to the face value? Face value is going to decline. Coupon rate is same. Coupon rate has not changed. Coupon rate is still existing at the 10%. Now look at here. Let's say the bond price is still 1000. Coupon rate, I mean yield, how do we calculate a yield? Coupon divided by price into 100. Since coupon is the interest payment, 100 divided by 1000, that amounts to the yield equals to 10%. If the face value has declined by 100 to 900, what happens? Coupon payment is still 100. The base price or the face value has become a 900, which is nothing but 100 divided by 9. 100 divided by 9 is going to give you the 11.11 percentage. That means the yield has increased. The individual who has bought this particular bond at a value which is less than a face value, so his profit margin has increased. Let's say other scenario where people are showing a great trust in these bonds. So what happens? Automatically the face value of the bond is going to increase. Where the face value has increased to 1100, coupon is still same. So 100 divided by 1100, that is going to give you the 9.09 percentage. So remember this very clearly. Where the bond price and the bond yield always move in the opposite direction. So if there is a greater demand for the bonds, what happens? The face value is going to increase. As a result, your yield is going to decline. If the people are not showing the trust in these bonds, what happens to these? The face value is going to decline, but the yield is going to increase. Can you see from this very simple diagram where the bond prices, if start increasing, bond yield is going to decline. If the bond price decreases, where the bond price has decreased to 900, the yield was the 11.11 percentage. So from examination point of view, remember this thing very clearly. There exists a inverse relationship between the bond price as well as the bond yield. So now let us look at what has happened in the United States of America, when the tariff war was on, where the treasury, the bonds which we generally call of 10-year treasury note yield was last up by 5 basis. That means to 4.31 percentage, and in fact the same price has increased to 4.51 percentage. That means the individual who is holding this particular bond, the government has to give the more amount of money because the yield is increasing. Ultimately, who is holding all these bonds? These bonds are being held by the individuals. If the yield of an individual increases, that means the government has to give more amount of money towards that interest payment, which we call it as the debt servicing. Okay, and look at even for the other treasuries of the 30-year treasury bond yield, which has in fact increased to 5.02 from a 4.715 percentage. Even though it seems to be a very small amount of money, considering the debt or the US holds this amount, this is going to be a huge amount of money. So let us understand why I'm saying it is going to be a very huge amount, even though there is a very small amount of a change. So let us understand what exactly is the debt of a USA. Can you see here on screen the debt of United States of America very clearly? where the US debt right now standing over more than 36 trillion dollar. More, yes, you heard it right, more than 36 trillion dollar worth of a debt that the US holds. This particular debt happens to be, I mean, more than, which has doubled just in the span of a 16 years or a 15 years, which is more than, can you see the debt increasing, debt to GDP ratio, which is standing at a 123 percentage. If the GDP happens to be the 100, debt is equal to 123 rupees. So remember this very clearly. So if you look at the total, the debt servicing that is being done by the United States of America, can you see very clearly? I mean, for the fiscal year 2025, the debt servicing equals to $952 billion. Yes. $952 billion, which the US pays for the people who have bought the treasury, or who happens to be the holders of the debt of the United States of America, which is equivalent to almost three times the size of the Pakistan's economy. Okay, now look at, as the time progresses, by the year 2035, this particular debt is going to be 1.783 trillion dollar. So you can imagine the accumulation of the debt, or the increase in the debt of the United States of America. So at the same time, let us look at the what where the India stands. Can you see here on the IMF dashboard, the India's debt to GDP ratio happens to be the 83.02. That means our debt is less than the GDP. Similarly, for China, it's 84.38%. The country which is at more worse happens to be the Japan, 249.67 percentage. At the same time, I just want to highlight to one more nation. I mean, remember the during the time of the 2008 financial crisis, which has spilled over even towards the EU. There we had the countries called, I mean, a derogatory term used to refer to the economies of four countries called as the pigs: Portugal, Italy, Greece, and the Spain. Let us look at where do they stand. Can you see here very clearly where the Spain stands? Spain stands right now at where the Greece is 168.87, Spain is happens to be 105.3. Look at Italy. Italy is 134.79, because this debt to GDP ratio is a very, very important macroeconomic indicator. If your debt to GDP ratio is increasing, that means that the nation's economy is quite fragile. If its macroeconomic indicators are, not stable, something like labor force participation rate, where does the inflation exist, all such things matter apart from the debt to GDP ratio. So why the US, I mean, why it is alarming trend is, for the first time, the US is spending more on the debt interest than the defense. Can you see here this very simple diagram? How the over a period of a time, the defense has, almost it is going to come down after, and now it is increasing. That is, the interest payments are increasing. So what has happened here is that if the Donald Trump has not backed down, the people would have shown lesser, I mean, they were selling of the bonds. So when the bonds were being sold, that means the government is not having any, greater amount of the trust in that. At that time, the bond yield is going to increase, so the government's interest payments are going to increase. So to, avert this crisis, he decided to back off from the particular, tariff war with the majority of the nation. So what might happen in the future? Let us look at some of the as. So first one, the even though the US debt to GDP ratio is existing on the, somewhere around 124%, it is a very less unlikely to default on its debt, because the debt that US is supposed to pay happens to be the dollar itself. So the government can print in its, as number of as much currency as possible. At the same time, what might happen? High deficit, continued large deficit, though avoiding default, may have a significant economic downside, because it is going to show that the investors will show a very less confidence. If the investors are showing a very less confidence, that means investment will not happen. And moreover, if the government starts borrowing more and more money, okay, that means the private players will not be able to borrow the money, which we call it as the crowding out effect, where the government is borrowing more money. As a result, the borrowing rate is going to increase in the economy, so private players will not be able to borrow from the economy. If the private players are not able to borrow from the economy, production will not happen. If the production will not happen, that means not more number of employment opportunities are being created. If the employment opportunities are not being created, that means wages are not going to increase. If the wages are not going to increase, ultimately it is going to have a negative impact on the consumption as well. And moreover, since the production has come down, that means supply has declined. If the supply has declined and the demand is still constant, that means we are going to see the inflation in the market. If we see the inflation in the market, at the time the Federal Reserve of the US is going to increase the interest rate. If they are going to increase the interest rate, that is again is going to add the pressure on the economy, and the economy will be pushed towards the recession. And moreover, we see that the relations between the Jerome Powell and Donald Trump not happens to be on a very good relations. Even though he happens to be the appointed by the Donald Trump itself, where he was first appointed for the 4 years, and then the President Joe Biden has extended his tenure by another 4 years, and where he is clearly saying that he's not going to relinquish the office and he is going to remain in the office, where he is openly challenging that Trump cannot remove him from the office. Can you see here? And moreover, the Trump is openly calling. Can you see this through this tweet? Cut in interest rates, Jerome, and stop playing the politics. So you can imagine all these things, that is the relation between the Trump and the Federal Reserve Chair. These are not going to send a very great signal to the market itself, which is again going to make market more volatile, and we are going to see more bloodbath in the market. So at the same time, it can also have, in the worst case scenario, the rising debt is go and rising interest rate will feed into each other and leading into the vicious cycle of borrowing and the economic strain. That means this is something, spiral effect is going to take place, and which is going to make the condition of the US more worst, as US happens to be the largest economy and all the nations economies are integrated. World economy will be at the danger. So even so, ultimately it is these things of the tariff war, the trade war, are not good sign for the economic growth of the entire world. So that's it in this particular video session, where we have understood why the Donald Trump has decided to back down from the tariff war, and what impact it is going to have on the treasuries, and how the yield is calculated. And we knew very clearly there exists a inverse relationship between the bond yield as well as the and bond price. So that's it. Thank you. Do like, do share, do subscribe. If you have any concern, do let us know in the comment section. Thank you.